William doesn't need any introduction. Um, I've known William for almost 30 years.
Although she doesn't look a day over 21.
Um, we worked together a long time ago, and in the year that I first met him and I first worked with him, William's book, In the Holy Mountain, From the Holy Mountain in the Shadow of Byzantium was published, and it was his the first book of his that I read. And I was really impressed, but also it was almost like opening up a secret history for me, because in the way history is taught in the world, you've got the Romans, and then whatever happened to the Romans in the east of their empire seemed to just disappear from normal historical parlance. People weren't talking about it. And then you just get on to the Renaissance and what happened in the rest of Europe. And so William opened up Byzantium for me, the entire Byzantine world, and also more importantly, showed me the connections that that part of the world has with us in Kerala. Christianity in Kerala comes from that part of the world. Our Christianity here is a part of that Eastern Christianity, and so there were many connections to be drawn. And a good chunk of that book is when when William is in Palestine and Israel, and looking at the history there, ancient history to Byzantine history, medieval history. I want, William, you'd clearly been to Palestine before you went for the research for this book. So tell me, when did you first go there? Who were you then? What did you go to do, and what did you see?
Well, first of all, I shouldn't let you off the hook on this one, because Miriam is the living embodiment of my book, in a sense, in that she represents something that you're very familiar with in this part of Kerala, in a very extreme form, in that not only is she from the Syrian Christian community, but her grandfather was a Syrian Christian from Mosul.
No, my grandmother was a Syrian
Okay, you tell your bit of yours.
My grandfather, who was a Malayali, married a Syrian Christian from Mosul in Iraq. So I am 1/4 Arab, and as William says, very much indicative and an example of the kind of history he talks about and uncovers.
And while directly having Middle Eastern blood as recently as the 1920s is unusual, the whole culture of this coastline is informed by contacts with the Middle East. And this is something I've come back to my new book, and we'll talk about this later. Yep. The book I'm writing at the moment, The Golden Road, starts off with a chapter about the links between the Malabar coast and the Red Sea. And every Syrian Christian here knows the story of St. Thomas supposedly coming down the Red Sea and arriving here and converting the Brahmins. But I think people probably don't yet know the other side of that story, which is that within the last 18 months, on the Red Sea coast at the port where sailors from India arrived, Berenike and Myas Hormuz, there have recently been discovered extraordinary Buddhist remains. So at the same time as Christianity and Judaism is arriving on this coast, Indic religions are being brought to Egypt, which is completely natural and not to be surprised. Today we think of transport mainly happening by road. If we want to go to Cochin, the chances are that you'll go by the highway. You won't get a boat from Calicut to Cochin. But that's not the case in the Middle Ages. People were hopping onto boats. And if you got the monsoon right, you could get from Calicut or Cochin to Egypt, which in the first century was part of the Roman Empire, in as little as 3 months. And vice versa, you have to wait for the monsoon winds to change direction, but you can get back from Egypt to here in 3 months. So much, much faster than it would have taken, for example, to get from here to Kashmir, which might have taken 6 or 7 or 8 months to get to overland. So we have to immediately rework our way of thinking. And From the Holy Mountain is a book which specifically looks at the spread of early Christianity from its homeland in Palestine through that early region. And today, when people talk about Christianity or Christendom, when people talked about Christendom in the Reformation era or the Renaissance, they were basically talking about Western Europe, forgetting that the homeland of Christianity is not Europe, it is Palestine. And that Christianity is as much an Eastern religion as Islam, Hinduism, or Buddhism. And again, we tend to think of our own age as being the globalized age. You can go to Calicut airport and be in Dubai in a matter of hours. But earlier versions of that were equally dramatic. Using the monsoon. India has in its geography inherent the propulsion to become the great early trading power of antiquity. Unlike my native Scotland or the Mediterranean, you have only got to put up a sail on the coast here and be driven in one direction for half the year and to be driven back again for the other half of the year. And the same is true on the Coromandel coast of going to Southeast Asia. Put up a sail, you'll find yourself in Java in one half of the year and can come back from Java in the other half. And the reason for that is the heating and the cooling of the Tibetan plateau. The heating in summer and then the contracting winds in winter gives this amazing effect, which means that Indians have had the easiest possible motivation to become great sailors in both directions from the earliest part of antiquity.
I want to circle back to Palestine.
Back to Palestine.
Yes. There's a lot these days about a land without a people for a people without a land. Was that land really without a people? Tell us about that land. Tell me about what you went there to do when you first went and what it was like.
So, things which previous generations of historians argued about and disagreed about now has less room for disagreement thanks to DNA studies.
Yes.
And DNA studies in Israel-Palestine and comparing it with Bronze Age skeletal remains and the DNA that can be extracted from them have made this very clear. The Palestinian Christian community has the closest genetic links of any community in the Middle East to the Bronze Age remains in both the hills of Judea and the plains of what used to be the Canaanite territories on the coastal plains. Next up, second equal, comes Sephardic Jews and Muslims. Both have slight intermixtures. The Muslim community intermarried with Bedouin and so on coming in from Arabia in the 6th century, and Sephardic Jews likewise with Arabian blood. The least connection to Canaanite remains, but nonetheless a strong connection, and very much there, is the Ashkenazi Jews who intermarried with peoples in Eastern Europe on the course of their migrations. But the Palestinian Christians and the tiny Sumerian community, which people often forget about, there's only a few hundred families of Sumerians left, but they actually even beat the Palestinian Christians for the direct identical DNA of what the inhabitants of Palestine at the time of the pre-Roman, pre-Greek, pre-Ptolemaic period, and the current inhabitants. So what you have when you go to a Palestinian Christian church in Bethlehem, or recently, sadly, tragically, we've seen on the TV the Palestinian Christian churches in Gaza, one with its community hall flattened by a bomb, the other with 2 old ladies shot by a sniper through the rose window in the front, those Palestinian Christians are the direct descendants of the first Christians, with very, very little intermixture, occasional intermarriages with maybe Crusaders or Byzantines, but they're basically the same genetic
The
stock
local people.
as the people who lived there. And this is absolutely cutting-edge DNA. It really cannot be quibbled.
And yet it is.
So, yes, in the 19th century, with the growth of more and more disgusting, racist, violent pogroms in Tsarist Russia,
Yeah.
Eastern Europe, the growth of a Zionist movement to try and find a homeland, search in Argentina, in Zanzibar,
Africa, yeah.
Ethiopia,
Yeah.
and finally the British are persuaded to recommend a homeland in what's Palestine.
Yeah.
At that point, at the Balfour Declaration, the British say they view with favor a Jewish homeland, it being understood that it does not interfere with the rights of the existing community. The existing community, just to be very clear, was 96%
Yes.
of the population.
Exactly.
96% were Palestinian Christians
Origin.
or Muslims.
Yeah.
By the first census of 1922, only 4 years later, the Jewish community has grown to 12%. The Palestinian Christians come third, with 10%.
Yeah.
And the Muslims are 85%. And then it's been declining
Ever
since that point.
One of the things that was interesting, because I read this book in '97 and then I read it again this week. And I remember then being sort of worried about things disappearing, history disappearing. While DNA studies are great, archaeological remains, manuscripts, books, that kind of tangible history was disappearing then when you were writing it. It is pretty much, I presume, all gone now.
Not all gone, but it's in some places a lot's gone. So to go through the different places I look at in this book, it starts off on Mount Athos, which
Yeah.
is in Greece.
In Greece.
No change, still
Yeah.
almost entirely Christian. A land which, incidentally, in 1922 had its Turkish Muslim population removed in the first exchange of population at the end of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
So what had been a mixed territory too becomes 100% Christian. You then move to the modern Republic of Turkey. Turkey has three distinct Christian groups. It has the Greek Orthodox Christians. 9/10 of that community left in 1922 in the precursor to the partition of India, which was the Greek-Turkish exchange at the end of the Ottoman Empire. The Turks go to Turkey, the Greeks go to Greece. And the only Greek Orthodox Christians left in the course of those population exchanges, which are extremely violent, and follow an attempt by Greece to invade Mediterranean Turkey, and the defeat of those forces by Ataturk. Following that, the only place that has a large Greek population is Constantinople itself. And in 1955, there's a pogrom there, a sort of Kristallnacht-style affair, and most of the Greeks leave, leaving a small number in the Fener area, the lighthouse area of old Istanbul. So that's the Greeks. Secondly, the whole story of the Armenians. In the course of the First World War, the Young Turk government, nationalistic Turkish government, commits the first genocide of the 20th century. 1.5 million Armenians are done to death. None of the efficiency of the Nazis, it's brute, rape, cudgels, starving in the desert. And there are only Armenians left in Istanbul today.
Yeah.
They Turkify their names, they keep their heads down, they're very discreet. But for example, the Magnum photographer Are Güler is actually Are Gulurian. And he's an Armenian, and is the great photographer of Istanbul and Turkey. But his name sounds Turkish. Actually, he's an ethnic Armenian. The third community, which is resonance to Kerala, is the Suryani. Suryani live in the southeast around Mardin and Diyarbakir. in ancient monasteries dating back to the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century, some of the oldest Christian churches anywhere in the world. Mar Gabriel, Der Zafran. When I was there for Holy Mountain in '94, there were tens of thousands. That has sort of stabilized, but the current Turkish government is encroaching on the land of the monasteries. They're not popular, obviously, with the nationalistic, slightly Islamist Erdogan government.
Yeah.
They, again, keep their heads down. They're basically allowed to continue, but their lands are being slowly expropriated and so on. But it's not as bad as it was when I was there, when they were being caught up in the PKK uprising, and there were often reprisals at village level and so on. So from there, the journey went into Syria, which when I went in '94 was the great refuge of the Christian communities. And many of the Armenians driven out of Turkey had ended up there, Syriani community, smaller other communities, including a large Latin community converted to Catholicism in the colonial period, and very confident but fearful of the future in '94, almost entirely gone except from Damascus itself now.
Really?
And
what, have they all migrated?
So all those Syrians that you see on the news broadcast trudging across Europe or
really?
trying to take boats to Lesbos or in camps in Turkey or being shut out of Hungary.
Are the Christians?
Many of those are Christians.
Wow.
And that community, who were so incredibly hospitable to me when I did this journey, I almost never had to take a hotel room in my entire time in Syria, famously received extremely flawed and very little hospitality on arrival in Europe, with the exception of my native Scotland, who took in many thousands, though whether the Syriani quite wanted to go and live in the Isle of Skye was not entirely clear, as I don't think there were quite as many there as there were originally. All these years later, a couple of Scottish winters has reduced the Syrian Christian number. So from there to Lebanon, which is a slightly different story. Again, Lebanon has the Maronite church. The Maronites were, for quite a period of time, they made the majority faith in Lebanon, and were slightly like the Zionists to the south, an aggressive minority defending their mountains with great violence. And the communities who were being at the boot end of this were the Palestinians driven out in '48, and various small communities of Shia and so on, who today make up Hezbollah, and not quite majority probably, but anyway, but certainly one of the larger communities.
Yeah.
So the Maronites, in the course of the Civil War, basically lost the Civil War, forced to share power with other groups in a very unstable fashion, and we've seen mass emigration of Maronites to the particularly United States and France.
Yeah.
Many Maronites from the colonial period speak good French, have their education in Paris and so on, and many have ended up in Lyon and in Paris. The Palestinian Christians, a different story again. Roughly 10% of the whole Palestinian community at the beginning of the 20th century, and suffered a little bit less than the Palestinian Muslims, because very much with an eye to PR, David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, specifically forbade the ethnic cleansing of cities such as Bethlehem and Nazareth, which, particularly Nazareth and Galilee. So Galilee in 1949 still had quite a significant Christian Palestinian community that has become smaller and smaller, but some Palestinian Christians within Israel proper have made good lives for themselves, speak good Hebrew, go to university. You have occasionally Palestinian Christian newsreaders, and sometimes they're wheeled out to talk for Israel in news conferences and so on. The Palestinian Christians in the West Bank, who found themselves under Israeli occupation from 1967, are again about 10% of the community. Complicated relations with the local Muslims. There's competition for resources. Everyone's being squeezed. And so you do find what was beginning in 94, but not really evident. Some pressure from the more Islamist elements on the Palestinian Christian communities. And either way, many young Palestinian Christians in the West Bank with their passports in to apply for visas to Detroit. Sydney particularly is a place Palestinian Christians have gone in large numbers. They find it easier than Muslims to get visas as Europeans and Western democracies view them as less likely to be radicalized, whether that's true or not.
True or not, yeah.
And that community now is significantly reduced from when I wrote the book. Nonetheless, it's still very much there. There are churches, and there are also the ancient monasteries, which I visit a lot.
Correct.
Mar Saba, Mar Gerasimus, in the deserts of the West Bank, which was an area which, in the Byzantine period, was filled with hermits and monasteries.
Christian,
yeah. And the final community are the Egyptian Copts. Again, a slightly different story. There are two different sorts of Copts, really, if you like. There are an urban elite who are rich, well-educated, run the pharmacies, run the jewelry shops. They are slowly emigrating to the United States and often do some damage to the community left behind in Egypt by demonstrating against Mubarak or Sisi every time he turns up in the States, which often gives them the reputation of being, in Indian parlance, anti-national. And then you have the village Fellahin Christian of Upper Egypt, who are farmers who suffered, when I was there, from straightforward terrorist attack by what they called the Irhabin, the Gamat al-Zamia. And they were emigrating slowly from the countryside to the poorer parts of Cairo. And there are large Christian suburbs of Cairo and Alexandria which suffer occasional attacks from Islamist groups. Bad during the Gulf War. Whenever, I mean, the pattern that's very familiar is whenever the West attacks the Middle East, it's the Christians who are often the most convenient, because they're viewed by some people as Western Christians.
Of the larger Christian, okay.
So during the Crusades, during the Gulf War, and no doubt now during the Houthi attacks, it'll be Christian communities that get attacked as proxies for the West. So a mess, but nonetheless, the community is still there. And wherever you go in the Middle East, with the exception, I suppose, of central Turkey, the areas of Iraq which were occupied by ISIS, and no, with those two exceptions, there are Christians everywhere, and they cling on in some of the oldest monasteries and churches in the world, maintaining some of the oldest rituals and earliest forms of Christianity, which also survive here in Kerala. And if you go to Valayapalli in Kottayam, or any of the monasteries and theological colleges around Kottayam, you will find not only these very ancient Aramaic rituals being preserved, but the traditions which record, whether strictly accurately or metaphorically, the arrival at the time of St. Thomas. And just to return to that which we discussed a little bit at the beginning, the archaeological evidence for links between Roman Egypt and Kerala are becoming stronger every year. Particularly, there's one excavation being run out of Chicago University, a guy called Steve Sidebottom, who is coming to the end of 20 or 30 years' work at the site of Berenike. Now, Berenike, there were two ports. If you'd set sail from here and wanted to sell your pepper and your cinnamon and your ivory, and also nard, and also silk, because the Silk Road basically didn't really exist until the Mongol period in the 13th century, and the main axis of east-west contact is here.
Kerala.
Kerala by sea to Roman Egypt. And for all, if you were a sailor wanting to make money, or a captain or a merchant, you set off not so much from calicut in the early period. Calicut has its great flourishing a little bit later in the...
Would be Muziris.
Yeah, it's Muziris, which is sort of Cranganore, Cochin, that whole area of the coast. And there is evidence that the Syrian Christians of this area used to stop off in the island of Socotra.
Where's that?
Socotra is between Yemen
Ah,
and Saudi,
okay.
I think, or the Hejaz coast.
Yeah.
It's the midway island that has freshwater springs,
Ah,
and which is why people stopped off there, because you needed fresh water to drink and so on, and for your ablutions and everything else. So Socotra seems to have been the sort of holiday destination, the Taj Hotel of its day, on the way. And there are a set of caves which have stalactites and all sorts of things, which have from a very early period been the great sacred sites of Socotra. And in there, you find Malu graffiti from an early point.
really?
Alongside, I'm ashamed to say, some Guju graffiti.
Well, all the sailors from the west of India.
It is, exactly.
Right.
It's so Barigaza was the other port, which is in modern Bharuch,
Gujarat.
in Gujarat. So Malayalam, Syrian Christian, you find images of Krishna, Trishuls, swastikas, Syrian Christian crosses,
Wow.
and all these in the Huck caves, side by side, with some graffiti by Palmyran Arabs, by Greek sailors from Alexandria, and all this stuff has been found in the last 3 or 4 years. But there is a very strong early Malayalam, Chera, Suryani component in this graffiti.
Nice.
Many of your ancestors were leaving graffiti
traveling
on the
out.
way. And then they arrive at Berenike, where these excavation tables. And the
You
excavations...
want to tell us where Berenike is today?
So Berenike is on the Red Sea coast of Egypt. So if you go down the Nile on a nice sort of... If you're in retirement and you decide to take a Nile cruise, you go halfway down the Nile, you stop off at just before Aswan, or at about in Tinue or so on, and then you head
Inland.
to the eastern desert. And it's a difficult journey. It's across desert, raw desert, and it takes a week from the Nile to the coast.
To the Red Sea.
And there are a series of rock shelters that also have Malu graffiti on it, where these caravans stopped off. And also, I mean, there's been a lot of study of this graffiti, and you get not only Gujaratis and Malus, you also get Roman wine merchants, so the equivalent of the Chianti exporters of today. There's a particular family who seem to have been the
Who had
great...
the monopoly of it.
They have the monopoly, well, not a monopoly, but certainly a large exporting business called the Peticius family, who were from north of Rome. And in the last few years, Peticius objects, graffiti, inscribed shards, gifts to temples have been found in Carthage,
Oh, wow.
in Alexandria, and in rock shelters in the eastern desert. And A. Peticius, with very firm, clear handwriting,
Type, yeah.
puts his name down. And as a very nice thing, recently they found in the Abruzzi, where this family were from, a tombstone of a man, and on it is a picture of him leading a camel across the desert, and there are 2 amphora of wine, because the largest Roman export to Kerala was wine.
Really?
The one thing you guys really wanted to buy from the Roman Empire was wine, so much so, and then this is another new discovery, that papyrus has turned up from a village, from a town called Oxyrhynchus. And one of the most widely performed plays in antiquity was Euripides' Iphigenia in Tauris. Now that has the story of this heroine Iphigenia arriving on a desert island. In the version in Oxyrhynchus, the action is moved to India. And some people think that the play may have been performed with actual Indian actors in Egypt, but they speak in a sort of, in a heavily Dravidian gibberish. it's like a sort of, as Peter
Like a
Sellers
pigeon.
or goodness gracious
Yeah.
me, Roman
Sketch.
of what Indians sounded like, with heavy consonants and
All of that.
Tamil syllables running off or Malu syllables running off in lots of P's and B's and D's, and so you have the first anti-Malayalam racist joke recorded in Oxyrhynchus. So by the time, so if there were enough Malus in Egypt for them to become a stock joke at the theatre, it
Yes.
implies that they were a familiar community,
Regular
and people
familiar.
would have got the joke.
Yeah. So we've just been informed that we have 5 minutes left. I'm not sure I'm going to open it out because it would be unfair to get just one question and no more. So I'm going to leave William with the last word, and I want him to tell us about this new book, which he talked about right at the beginning.
So a lot of the stuff I've been talking the last 5 minutes is from this new book. It's called The Golden Road. It's out September. I very much hope Govind will invite me back next year to talk about it. And I intend to spend longer in your beautiful state and luxuriate longer at Paragon, eating delicious fish and putting on weight and having malu paratas and all that. But it's an awful lot. It's my most Kerala book, actually. It's got a lot of Kerala in it. And starts in Kerala, yeah. And one little statistic to finish with that I think will surprise people. So there's an extraordinary rubbish dump which had this play in at this village town called Oxyrhynchus. And through a reason that it never rains there, and the desert has been undisturbed, in the late 19th century, people started finding rubbish dumps full of papyrus. People were throwing out their papyrus. And among the things they found in the first season of digging there in the 1890s was the Gospel of Thomas, an unknown gospel, poems by the lesbian writer Sappho, some quite explicit, the sayings of Jesus, some of which seemed to precede the Gospels and which found their way into the Beatitudes, blessed are the peacemakers, and all that sort of thing. More recently, though, and this is the final point I'd like to make today, there is a single papyrus now in Vienna, which has been around for a while, but only recently has been properly studied in its importance. It's called the Mosiris Papyrus. And it's a random shipping container invoice. A single container which traveled from Mosiris to Berenike on the Red Sea coast. And the papyrus is written by the Alexandrian Greek, probably Jewish shipowner. And it's a receipt for the items which he's received from a merchant in Kerala. And it's just one container on one ship called the Hemaplon. And everything else from the entire trade has disappeared. But through this miracle of preservation, one shipping container survives complete. And not only does every item be itemized, its cost is itemized, and with perfect particular accountancy, the customs take is itemized, which is 25%. So the amount that he owes the authorities for bringing this stuff in from Kerala is also recorded. And what has astonished people is the astonishing value of this stuff. So today we think of pepper, you go out to the supermarket and you don't think twice about buying pepper. It'll last you probably a couple of years and it won't cost you more than 200 rupees, let's say. Pepper in first century Rome was an ultra luxury item that the very rich would show off to their friends. And the same was true of the other things which were imported from this coast. Cotton, again, we think of it as quite a normal, everyday thing, but it's the best thing to wear in the heat, and was considered a luxury on a par with silk. Nard, not something any of us...
We're getting death stares from
okay,
the
we'll
left.
take 2 more minutes, I'm afraid. Nard, which is what, those of you who know your Gospels, Mary and Martha put on the feet of Christ. It's a Himalayan unguent, beautiful smelling. You rub it in to your esteemed guests. That was exported from here. 29 boxes of nard, 64 tons of ivory, and I can't remember how much pepper, but the total value of the container would have bought the merchant who imported it enough money to buy the largest estate in central Tuscany at the height of the Romans. So one successful container from here successfully brought through Somalia, past the Houthis, and into Alexandria and onto the Nile, would have made a fortune for a whole community. More important than that, so vast...
We're going to get into a lot of trouble,
I'm going to finish this. I am going to finish this. So vast is the customs take for the Roman government of this stuff arriving, 250 ships, each one containing maybe 20 or 30 containers, that they now think, and this is the final thing, that 1/3 of the entire Roman imperial budget to keep the empire going from Britain to Germany to the Rhine frontier to Algeria to
the entire empire.
1/3 of the Roman imperial budget came from the customs take at Berenike, with things being imported from Kerala.
Madam, excuse me.
And on that note, don't worry, we got it. Thank you.
Okay.
I would suggest that all of you go out and get William's book. It's an old book, but it's a really useful book and a very interesting book, and moreover gives you a lot of information about the land of Palestine and Israel, where things are happening today and we are being told stories about it being very complicated. It's not. The history is written, it's available, and it's incontrovertible. So thanks a lot and enjoy your next session.